great. Danielle, thank you for coming. If you could give us an introduction of the university and college where you're at, and also give us an explanation of your field.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Danielle Goldman. I'm a PhD candidate in the Interdepartmental Neuroscience Program at Yale University. And here I work in the Mood Disorders Research Program under the mentorship of Dr. Hilary Blumberg. And my laboratory's main goal is really to better understand the neuroscience underlying mood disorders. So across the lifespan from childhood and adolescence through elderly populations and their relation to suicide risk. And we really aim to use the information that we gain in the lab to apply to the generation of new treatments, including those that kind of embrace new technologies that can be implemented outside of the laboratory in the general community. And more specifically, my thesis research aims to better understand and differentiate the development of depression specifically across two disorders, major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder. And in order to study this, I use state-of-the-art neuroimaging methods to look at impaired function and structure in adolescents and young adults.
Wonderful. Yeah, that sounds very interesting. So are you hoping to be a professor one day?
So I'm actually hoping to work in policy and bring my scientific expertise over into the legislative realm. I'm really interested in kind of what can be taken from the laboratory and applied directly into the community. So outside of the lab here at Yale, I'm involved in a lot of outreach and policy related activities that have really inspired me to pursue this kind of work. So right now, I serve as an early career policy ambassador with the Society for Neuroscience. So I meet with Congress people and other kind of administrators at the Society for Neuroscience, which is an international community of academics, industry experts, and legislators really interested in promoting neuroscience. And that has really led me to really hope to consider pursuing a career in that. Yeah.
That's great. So let's head into my general question is like, do you have any like outside hobbies or interests?
Yeah, so outside hobbies and interests. So I grew up in New York City. So I grew up really just loving to try new restaurants and cuisines and types of food. So I love always exploring new cities and seeing what kind of food and exciting cultural opportunities they have to offer, and then taking those back home and trying to cook them myself. So when I'm not traveling, I really love to try new recipes. I love Thai and Greek food. I'm exploring a little bit more now, but those are my specialties now.
I see. It's wonderful. I hope to visit New York one day, so we'll see about that. Great. So I just wanted to ask, what led you into your field of study, and where do you think it's headed towards in the future?
So that's a great question. So, or two sets of questions. So first, back when I was in high school, I was actually offered a really invaluable experience to start working in a laboratory of a professor at the New York University Child Study Center. That's where I really got my first expertise in kind of the day-to-day life of a scientific researcher and what really goes into the behind the scenes work of advancements in science. And it was that opportunity that allowed me to really understand the intricacies of science, the intricacies of how to do research, from asking questions out of curiosity to how to turn these questions into rigorous scientific experiments, and then how to take the results of those experiments and be able to communicate them both efficiently, but also kind of realistically in terms of taking what we're learning from the laboratory and making sure that the academic community, the general community, can really understand what this means for society moving forward. And when I was in high school, I attended a high school that was very, very rigorous, very stressful. And I unfortunately saw firsthand a lot of the mental health struggles that went alongside that. And being able to work in a laboratory that focused on the scientific underpinnings of depression, of mental health in adolescence back then allowed me to really get hands-on experience and an understanding of this is what I want to study moving forward in my career. So I was able to really have that unique opportunity of seeing it firsthand as a high school student, seeing what it was, what these struggles meant for adolescents, for their families, and their friends like myself, and seeing what researchers were doing to try to change and affect that. So that is kind of where my interest in adolescent mental health stemmed from. And when I was in college, I majored in neuroscience and behavior, and I continued kind of gaining more of an academic focus and understanding of psychiatry, psychology, neuroscience, all of these interrelated fields that are so important in adolescent mental health. And that really inspired me to pursue a PhD in neuroscience, because I knew I really wanted to become an expert in the field of neuroscience. But before doing that, since I was really interested in how this research would affect society, and knowing what I know now, and really hoping to continue into the field of policy work. Before I started my PhD, I also wanted to kind of get more of a background in policy and ethics and kind of how science can affect society. So I also obtained a master's degree in bioethics, where I was able to get more experience in kind of the intersection of these fields and how the legal system and the law plays a role in this, how different vulnerable populations like children, like elderly populations, how societal factors were important in conducting research as a scientist, and how to bridge communication gaps between these fields. So my path was kind of focused, but also kind of wavy, in that I knew that I did really, really care and was passionate about adolescent mental health. But I wanted to make sure that when I did pursue higher education in adolescent mental health, I was able to bring in a lot of interdisciplinary knowledge. So both from the scientific perspective, but also from ethics, policy, other more humanities focused areas that I think are really important as a scientist to understand as well. And in terms of your second question of kind of where I think the field is now and where I think it's going to go in the future, I think I'm very lucky to be a graduate student in this field at the current time, because I feel like there is a lot of bridging the gaps between science in this quote unquote, like there's this saying that science happens in the ivory tower, where science is conducted in the lab, in schools, in hospitals, but sometimes it doesn't directly affect the societies that it's actually studying and hoping to impact. And I think that that's starting to change. And as someone who is really interested in policy work, I think it's really exciting for me to be involved at this time, because I'm working with amazing mentors, advisors, in both my lab in particular with Dr. Blumberg, as well as some other amazing faculty members in my department and at Yale in general, who really hope to teach and train us, the future scientists of the world, whether we stay in academia, stay in academics, or go into other fields and bring the knowledge that we learn in the lab to society, that it is important to consider both how kind of neuroscience can influence policy, but also how policy can influence neuroscience. So that has really led to a shift in a lot of the questions that researchers are asking in this field. So I'm hoping that in the coming years, we're going to see a lot more, more real direct benefits from the lab to, in particular, adolescents, my particular focus, but also just those suffering from mental health struggles in general. And I guess also just even more specifically, the last 2 years, seeing what the COVID-19 pandemic has done both on physical, but also mental health, and seeing this kind of shift in the field to focus on how we can study things that are going to really aim to improve the mental health of those struggling directly affected by COVID-19, whether suffering themselves or through family or friends. And I think, and I think that shift in the field has also been really exciting to see.
Mm-hmm. I see. I love that story of yours. It's very inspiring. Thank you so much for sharing. I love the connections you made and also the story you gave. I think it's very well thought out, and I think that's why you're here today. um, yeah. Sorry about that. That
No,
was
that's okay.
all
This
right.
is what happens when we're all home now.
Yeah. So you said you study mood disorders, right?
Yes.
All right. So I just wanted to know, what is your current research that you're doing, if you've done anything in the past or if you're going to do anything for the future, and also any data or latest findings in your lab.
Of course. So I guess starting out some of the, I don't know how far back I should go, but I guess my first kind of foray into research and what my old lab primarily studied. My old lab really focused on specifically major depressive disorder in adolescents, looking specifically at a symptom of those suffering from major depression called anhedonia, which is basically the inability to experience pleasure, or finding that you're really not motivated, or you don't find pleasure in activities that you used to find enjoyable, and trying to understand specific like brain associations with the symptom of anhedonia, because major depression, I mean, all mood disorders are very complicated mental illnesses, and they don't look the same in every individual who suffers from them. So being able to kind of get to the root of understanding of individual symptoms can really help to more individualize diagnoses, treatments, and prevention strategies. So my old lab focused on the symptom of anhedonia and some neuroscientific underpinnings, both functional and structural, relating to that. But my lab currently with Dr. Blumberg, I guess most recently a paper that just came out that I was the first author on, used a new functional neuroscientific technique that really looked at differences in brain activity in those suffering from bipolar disorder, specifically, I guess, speaking to kind of the differences in presentations between individuals suffering from these disorders. Not everyone suffering from bipolar disorder presents the same way, even at the same time. There's a lot of highs and lows that are associated with the disorder. And I was really interested in seeing if there were any functional neuroscientific differences between what we call mood states. So the highs, or the elevated or manic episodes of bipolar disorder, or the lows, which are the more depressive episodes. So I looked at differences between mood states, and I found that there were a lot of more severe, more exaggerated differences in activation and connectivity that, sorry, I don't know if you saw that like weird flicker of light on my end. Sorry about that. But seeing these differences in a measure of what we call functional connectivity in adolescents and young adults suffering from depressive symptoms while they were being scanned. So that was really interesting and actually really surprising for myself and my lab mates, because traditionally a lot of research in bipolar disorder, especially in adults, does not necessarily look at individual mood states of those with bipolar disorder. They typically lump them together, and being able to find these differences associated with more individualizing factors of bipolar disorder really makes it kind of a new research or new area of research that we want to question and investigate, because during this time, we know that clinically, so when adolescents and young adults kind of present to clinicians, when they seek help, when they go for help and meet with mental health professionals, oftentimes there is a misdiagnosis, or there's a not a clear diagnosis when these adolescents first show with symptoms of depression, because these symptoms of depression can look both like bipolar disorder or another mood disorder, which I studied in my prior lab, major depressive disorder. So being able to kind of see that there are these differences specific to the depressed state in bipolar disorder sheds light on new research that really needs to be done to better understand the depression of bipolar disorder, and now specifically take that and directly compare it to the depression of major depression, which is, I guess, answering the future work question. That is what I'm focusing on for my main project of my PhD, my dissertation work, and that hopefully will be coming out in the next year or two.
Wonderful. That's great. I can't wait to see that if it does come out. So I just wanted to know, like, what neural processes in the brain are activated if we are in a certain mood state? Like, what's the difference between uh, an adolescent with the brain who has, let's say, a mood disorder like depression and someone who doesn't? Is there anything like a difference in the two?
So I think based on where the field is now, the way that research is conducted, we look more at a group level rather than an individual level. So it's really hard to say, looking at one brain of someone who may be depressed and someone who isn't depressed, looking between those two brains, I don't think the field is there yet to be able to say that there's definitely going to be this difference in activation or a difference in kind of the neuroscience behind that. But that, I think, is where the field is definitely going. There's a lot of new techniques that are arising every day, especially if some of my colleagues here at Yale that do a lot of this work, integrating a lot of computer science and a lot of other fields that are able to use something called machine learning that's going to be able to ideally, knock on wood, in the future, be able to identify at the individual level the differences in the brain between depressed and not depressed individuals. But at a group level, what we're trying to see is there is like, I'd say there isn't necessarily one region of the brain or one particular area of the brain that in isolation would cause or be associated with these depressive symptoms, but rather the brain as we know it really works like a well-oiled machine. Like every part has its function and contributes to like a better whole working machine. So there is a neural circuitry, so circuits connecting multiple areas of the brain, multiple regions of the brain that can go more haywire when adolescents, young adults, or even adults are suffering from mood disorders. And what we're trying to understand is if those differences in activation in these regions are connected with one another, and if there's kind of structural abnormalities that underlie that as well. So if we're seeing differences in the function, can we find specific structural issues in the brain too that kind of associate that can help to better explain why we're seeing what we're seeing?
So when well, let's say some kid like has depression, right? And you would give them some sort of like drugs, let's say like serotonin inhibitors, right?
Mhm,
There's like, I don't know, Celexa, Lexapro, there's
mhm.
like so many of these different uh let's say inhibitors, and they're basically drugs. So do you know if any of these specific drugs have any negative effects on the brain in the long term or throughout the rest of the organs in the body?
So I think every individual is going to have different success or lack of success rates of using these drugs or pharmacological treatments. And I think that a lot of people have made such amazing strides in developing these drugs and treatments, and they help so many people. But I also think that it's important to not put kind of a halt on other forms of interventions that are being developed as well, because as you suggest, some people may have side effects, or for some people these drugs may not work equally as well. So for some people, things like Lexapro, like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, they work amazingly, but they don't work for everyone. And I think something that is a risk of using some of the drugs is sometimes there is misdiagnosis. Sometimes, this isn't a common occurrence, but sometimes, especially in adolescence, symptoms are not really presenting the same way as they would in adults, and you don't want to put any children at a higher risk than they need to be. So I think there's been a lot of great strides in the scientific community now to focus on the development of more targeted and more individualized interventions that can be used alongside drugs or these types of interventions that kind of help to mediate some of these effects. So for example, our laboratory is focused also on creating an intervention called Be Smart, which is an intervention that's meant to be delivered alongside rather than instead of drugs, that help to focus on kind of strategies that adolescents and young adults can use when they're feeling down or elevated, or they're feeling the symptoms of bipolar disorder. And it's also helpful to note that a lot of these interventions, there may be, I guess, bringing back the policy aspect of this as well. A lot of these drug-based interventions may not be as easily accessible, either due to financial reasons or inability to access mental health care treatment. So I think a lot of the scientific community is trying to develop these other interventions, like the one that my lab is doing now, that are more accessible. So this intervention that we're working on is primarily delivered via telehealth. So like we're talking now, right over Zoom, so that you don't need to physically be in person or near a mental health care professional. It can be delivered remotely. So I think that there's so much promise in the drugs that exist now, as well as the drugs that are currently in development by a lot of laboratories in the scientific community. But seeing as every individual is going to be affected differently by these interventions, and there may be side effects, they may not work as effectively for some people than others, I think it's also important to note that there are a lot of other great interventions that aren't drug-based that are in development as well.
So would you consider those all like antidepressants of like combinations of therapies and also drugs? And also, what's your opinion on specifically electroconvulsive therapy?
So I don't have a lot of expertise on electroconvulsive therapy, so I don't want to speak out of turn. I'm sorry. But I wouldn't consider all of them antidepressants, just because some of the interventions also are kind of, they're not specific to just the lows of depression, but they can generalize to the highs or the elevated nature of manic episodes, which are also really the hallmark of bipolar disorder. So individuals suffering from that disorder don't just experience the depression and the hopelessness and the guilt that are associated with the lows, but they can also be more irritable, more excitable, and some of these drugs and other interventions are aimed to really alleviate some of those symptoms as well. So not always specifically antidepressants, they can be, but they can also help to alleviate some of the highs as well.
I see. So, have you ever come across any misconceptions in your field, or is there any thing that you have disagreed with specifically with research?
I think I think actually speaking to this last question we were talking about, I think a common misconception specifically about bipolar disorder that I've learned is that um, in general society, in pop culture, on social media, I think there's this kind of stereotype of those suffering from bipolar disorder as always being this irritable, high, manic individual. And even when I was growing up, I think there was that stigma behind that in a lot of pop culture and in TV shows that I watched and movies that I watched. And being able to work in this laboratory and work on my PhD here has really shed a lot of light on what bipolar disorder is, and it's not that. And I think that it's really important to understand that those suffering from bipolar disorder are suffering from a range of symptoms that are not just characterized by those three words that are typically seen in the media. And I think as researchers, we know that, and we, not just speaking on behalf of myself, but I think as a field, I think it's really important to bridge that gap between, I mean, speaking again to this ivory tower, like we know that, but the general community might not. And I think it's important to make sure that there is better communication between and bridging, and like I said, bridging the gap between these fields, because we don't want these misconceptions being like construed across media platforms, both kind of TV and movie wise, but also social media, to make sure that there is a lessened stigma behind these disorders, specifically bipolar disorder, because it is really important to have early intervention, early prevention strategies, and being able to kind of promote the idea that bipolar disorder is not just that will help others feel more comfortable reaching out for help, and a better understanding of what they or their family members may see. And I mean, just in general, we've seen great strides in both your and my generations, kind of feeling more comfortable talking about mental health in general, talking about what we're feeling, expressing what we're feeling, and knowing when, or having an inkling of when something might be wrong. So I think there have been really, really great strides in that, and moving past misconceptions of prior generations in terms of the stigma behind mental health. So more specifically, I guess, what I've seen is that this misconception behind some of the more specific disorders have kind of lessened, but I've seen in my lifetime that that's something that I think is definitely something that's important moving forward to help kind of alleviate that misconception.
I see. That's great. I totally agree with what you're saying. Um, so as my final question, I just wanted to like ask you, um, so is there like what was your specific, if you had one, like inspiration? I think you already touched on this. So like inspiration to pursue your career, and also like mainly general advice for younger people who are aspiring to be in a field similar to yours.
Yeah. So in terms of what inspired me, I think, yeah, I briefly touched on it a little bit before, but I was really struck by seeing what mental health struggles looked like in my friends, in kids my age when I was growing up, when I was in middle school and high school. And that led me to ask a lot of questions about why and how. And I was just really curious about where this was coming from. And I knew that I didn't just want to Google it on my own. I wanted to kind of get more hands-on experience of trying to understand what this was, and people who pursued a career in better understanding this. So I was really inspired to, and I guess this speaks to my general piece of advice for young people who are interested in this. I think do not be afraid to reach out to professors, to directors, to people who are in the scientific careers that you might be interested in. You don't have to have a lot or even any experience to reach out. When I reached out to the first professor that I worked with, I had zero experience. I was 15 years old. I had never been in a laboratory before. I had taken biology laboratory in high school, but that was it. And I think having the motivation to kind of just send an email and introduce myself as a high school student who was interested in this, who saw this firsthand and was really caring about trying to make a difference early on. I was lucky enough to have a professor respond to me and say, hey, I come into my lab, shadow, gain more experience in this. It's a really cool field. You'd love it. And I'm not saying that it's always going to be easy, but do not let one or two unanswered emails get you discouraged. That's always going to happen. Even now as an adult, like I get so many emails of or like unanswered emails. That happens. But I think it's important to know that as a young person, you do not have to wait for experience to gain more experience. I think having the motivation and the internal drive just to say, hey, this is cool, or like, I really want to learn more about this. There are, specifically in science, there are professors, there are researchers who are eager to help the next generation of researchers, and it starts young. And for me in particular, like I started young, and I know I want to give back to the next generation too. And a lot of the people in the scientific community are the same way. So do not feel as if you have to wait until you get to college or later to get involved in a lab, or just start conversations with people in the field. Send an email. It is the quickest and easiest way to get involved, and it's more fun that way too.
I really love that advice. Thank you so much for that. I actually can relate to a lot of what you said, and I also I got my research position in one of my first one by sending an email, so it
See?
worked. Yeah, so I'm just like you, and I'm starting this. An example of my initiative. So something I just like doing. So
May
yeah.
I ask what lab you're working in, or how you got your first research experience?
Yes, so I am a part of the UCI, University of California, Irvine's Spatial Neuroscience Lab, and they are studying navigation right now in the brain
Oh,
and
very cool.
dementia related.
Very cool. So are you doing any of the like neuroimaging aspects of it too, or looking at
I'm doing
behavior?
most of like literature reviews right now, so like writing, because it's online. I'm not physically in the lab yet, but hopefully I'll get there because of COVID. So yeah, so it's pretty fun.
That's exciting because you're getting a good background of kind of the history of the field and the exciting new papers that are coming out, and learning how to read journal articles, which are a beast in and of themselves, like learning how to understand scientific writing. That's really great. I'm very excited for you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm so glad you came today. I actually learned a lot. It was very fun. So thank you so much for coming today. I appreciate your time. I hope you have a great day.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. It was great
Yeah, of
meeting you.
course. Yeah, you too. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.